Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs, your award-winning Tottenham Hotspur podcast. We are back. And look, you know what time it is. Of course, we open the January transfer window on style here in the Last Word on Spurs. If you're listening to us for the first time, you can find us on iTunes. We're on Spotify. We're across all major audio platforms. We're, of course, on X. We're on Instagram. We are on Facebook too. We're joined by a very, very special guest to Last Word on Spurs. A familiar face to those that have listened and watched Last Word on Spurs for many, many years. And delighted to have this man back alongside me. He's, of course, my co-host for a number of these wonderful January transfer window shows that we're bringing you through the month. We've got the wonderful Matty Hayes back. Matt, how are you, my man?
Ricky, I'm so pumped for another month of this. Just before we came live, you said to me, "Here we go again," and I got a shiver down my spine. Now that could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. Only the next 28 days will tell us. But I'm so excited for another month of content with you. And well, there's no better way than to kick it off with this incredible guest we've got.
Absolutely. Now, stupidly, here I was thinking, day 3, we may have actually ordered a signing before we bring on our wonderful, esteemed first journalist to be joining us here, hopefully a couple of times this month. But Spurs being Spurs, they are keeping us waiting. Let's hope it's not for too much longer. A man that can tell us all about that and more. We've got a wonderful sports commentator, Talk Sports' very own, Ben Jacobs is back on Last Word on Spurs. Ben, love to see you back with us. How are you? You well?
Great to be back. Happy New Year to you and to everybody listening. And as you say, 3 days into the window, and Spurs, who will be busy, are still keeping us not guessing, but waiting. But I don't think that we will have to wait too much longer. I think we're going to have some positive news to bring you in the next 48 hours or certainly the next week.
Amazing. Look, Ben, we always ask you firstly, how have you been? It's been a while since we've had a chance to catch up. I know it's been busy for you, especially this time it gets even mega busy. How have you been recently?
Well, the first thing to say is I think like a lot of people that are listening, there's a distraction in the darts, and James Maddison no doubt will be across this one as well, even though Luke Littler is actually a Manchester United fan. So that's been a really interesting story. But personally, looking forward to the window, I covered the Club World Cup in Saudi Arabia following Manchester City over the festive period. And then I got back in the last few days and now gearing up towards January. I don't think we're going to see as crazy a January as 12 months ago when Chelsea kind of made waves. I don't think that it's going to be as dramatic as a really busy summer window, but it's just really important, as I always say, to put in the work outside of the window. And as a journalist, you develop your relationships, especially with ever-changing clubs that make senior executive appointments. Spurs is a new project. Manchester United is becoming a new project. Chelsea's still a relatively new project. So you spend a lot of your time really outside of the window trying to make genuine and personal relationships. And then that means when the window opens, you can start calling people up and trying to find out a bit of information. But if you start on January the 1st as a journalist, you're going to be behind. It's a bit like an exam. I always describe it as you've got to revise for an exam, then pass the exam. And if your window's the exam, then the revision period, i.e. your network building, actually comes in the weeks building up to the window opening.
Well, Ben, listen, I think all our viewers and listeners always agree whenever you come on here, you've passed the exam with absolute flying colours, which is why we always bring you back for more, most certainly. Look, I think it's fair to say it's been a bit of a whirlwind last 5-6 months for Tottenham since Ange Postecoglou got the job in the hot seat for Spurs. We had the pleasure of having you on actually at the time of his appointment. I think all of us, to some degree, were a bit in the unknown as what to expect. But look, he has made an absolute instant impact with a number, or should I say, a lot of the majority of Spurs fans. We currently sit Spurs 5th in the Premier League table, just a point off the top 4 and 6 points off the top at the time of recording this, along with playing some incredible, breathtaking football that hasn't been seen for a long time at the football club. Got to ask you before we come into all the transfer stuff, and don't worry, guys, there's plenty of it to come. Don't worry. Got to ask you, Ben, what have you made of Ange Postecoglou's impact at Tottenham and his start to the season?
Well, I think that he's been a breath of fresh air, and one of the most important things for Postecoglou was to get everybody to buy into the system, the players, and maybe he still needs to shape his squad to have an exact fit, because it has been a bit Jekyll and Hyde, but from a fan perspective, from day one, there's buy-in. And I think that's partly because you go from Conte ball to Ange ball, and regardless of results, there's going to be goals, it's going to be open. When we first spoke, when I was last on, Postecoglou was new, and I was explaining that his Celtic team and his philosophy more generally were quite gung-ho. They played wide, they played quick, they played direct, they had a high line, and all of that leads to having a go. And you've sort of sensed with Tottenham that they can, in that theory under Postecoglou, be victims of their own downfall, but you also feel like they're never out of a game. And against Brighton, for example, in the 4-2 loss, I think it's evident that there is still work to be done in building this team to fit the system. But in the 4-1 win against Newcastle, Spurs were superb. And even in the loss to Chelsea with only 9 men, they also proved that they can be positive, they can be direct, they can be risk takers. And if you take the risk, it sometimes comes with a reward. So I think there's a lot to like. I also think that Postecoglou has done himself a lot of favours off the field, because for all of the gung-ho nature and the excitement and the boldness and the risk-taking, he's very level-headed off the field. And he's making it clear that this is a new project. And much like Chelsea, for example, who are intimating that they need 4 windows to get what they need before they should be judged, I think Postecoglou's right to point out that they've still got to fully build out the recruitment hierarchy. They've still got to find a way to work with each other. And then when you add all of the injuries as well, these overnight results may come, but won't always be consistent. So you go from kind of thinking, are Spurs title contenders? Are they one of the Champions League favourites? To they weren't very good against Brighton, or they slipped up at home to West Ham, or they lost at home to Villa. Games where at that point you felt if they won, they would have ended the year top of the table. But all in all, I think Maddison is obviously a brilliant signing who is sorely missed. There's a bunch of other injuries. You've got a very likable manager. You've got a fan base that feel like they're always going to have a go and they're going to stick to their own philosophy. And as a football fan, if your team is going to lose, you want them to lose fighting. And if you feel like every game there's that consistency of identity and excitement, then when it goes well, they're going to pick up points. And regardless of what anyone thinks about Spurs and the little wobble, I suppose, before the last few games that they had, when they got off to a flyer, which was maybe a bit misrepresentative, to be 5th now, and 5th might be good enough for Champions League football, to be 6 points off the top, to be 1 point off the top 4, and to have only scored, I think it's a goal less than Liverpool, the leaders, and 2 goals less than Manchester City, who are usually the free scorers, all without Harry Kane. I think that's a fantastic start.
You mentioned the injuries there, Ben, and that's something I want to dive into a little bit more, because I think even if we had a full strength squad for the entire season so far, those numbers that you just listed out there would be impressive for Postecoglou when he's come in and completely transformed the team. But that extra pain that he's had of having to deal with these injuries, he admitted himself recently that it was deeply disappointing to lose Christian Romero, as we're looking to potentially be without him until the end of January, adding to the list that he's had to deal with Mickey van de Ven, James Maddison, Rodrigo Bentancur, who made a miraculous return at the weekend, Manor Solomon, Ryan Sessegnon and Ivan Perisic. You then look at Heung-min Son, Pat Matar-Sarr and Yves Bissouma heading out to AFCON and the Asian Cup respectively. Add on top of that, the suspensions that we've had to deal with this season with Destiny Udogie, Christian Romero, Yves Bissouma by 2 and Dejan Kulusevski. It's not been an easy road for Postecoglou by any stretch of the imagination. And I think when this all started happening, he came out with a brilliant quote where he said, as a manager, you're either in chaos or waiting for the chaos. What have you made, I suppose, of the way that Postecoglou has navigated the season with all these different fires going around him?
Well, I think we need a little bit more of a bigger sample size to work out what's caused the influx of injuries. Some of them, of course, are just unlucky, but I think teams that have persistent injuries at this number usually also have an underlying cause. And some of it might be down to the fact that they're doing more running or they're training differently. Some of it might be down to style. And when you play stretched and when you play width and when you play a high line, of course, players are constantly having to cover. They're under more pressure. So you need to almost analyze that over time, because when you look at a lot of the injuries that you outlined, they're not specifically the fault of the system or the club or a lack of injury prevention or anything else. It does just feel like bad luck. But again, Spurs will want to be sure that they're not doing something that on the field is reflecting in a very exciting manner, but off the field can be more prevented over time. And you need a certain kind of player for a certain kind of style. looking at Chelsea, Reece James in the role that he plays, even though he's had a chronic hamstring problem that's needed surgery, is in a role that requires him almost by default, because of what's being asked of him, to put more strain. And therefore, if he's susceptible for a certain kind of injury under that style, he might get more injured, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I think that from Tottenham's point of view, I'm told the newer parts of the executive team want to be using more data and want to be looking at more preventative things to see whether there's any kind of pattern, even if individually they all just seem like a bad tackle or a player pulling up. And these are the kind of marginal gains. But what I would say is that with the injuries, they've given others opportunities. So look at Richarlison. There's no guarantee, if everybody's fit, that he's leading the line. And instead he gets, I think it's 5 Premier League goals in the month of December. And that just might get him going. Destiny Udogie, who was a Paratici signing, has been absolutely excellent. James Maddison is not far off returning, and one player could make a difference. And then when Maddison's back, there's almost a decision to be made, because you can play Son in a more direct, near Kane-like role. And in the early part of the season, he seemed to enjoy that freedom. Or you can allow Richarlison to lead the line, and then Son goes back to a kind of wide forward. And if that's the case, he's used to that position and they might all be able to play together. But it's going to be important to understand who Maddison connects best with. And can Maddison also get the best out of Richarlison? Or is it a Maddison-Son partnership that he wants to focus on? So I think the big byproduct is ultimately the fact that the bench is looking a bit thin, and 1 or 2 more injuries, and you start worrying that when you're losing a game or you need to change a game, you've not got that depth or quality to do so. So I think it is important that some of these names come back. I also think the other thing with Spurs, if I'm being brutally honest, is that there's 1 or 2 players that need to improve discipline as well, because it hasn't just been injuries. There's been 1 or 2 suspensions as well. The game against Chelsea, Spurs were in control. They went 1-0 up. It was a brilliant first 20 minutes for Tottenham. And then needlessly, I felt they let the game boil over. Absolutely. And it's a bizarre situation, because there was so much credit for how Spurs handled being down to 10, then being down to 9. But I think they lost their heads as well. And I don't think there was a need for those sendings off. And if Tottenham had realised that they were being sucked into a derby and it was turning ugly, and if they'd have kept their heads and there were a few warning signs before each of the red cards, then if that's 11 against 11, as I think James Maddison pointed out to maybe John Terry on social media, Spurs are going to win that game comfortably. So I think Postecoglou will be looking at discipline for certain players. I think he'll be looking at depth, particularly off the bench. But ultimately, the silver lining is what I mentioned, that you lose a few players, and maybe perversely, that's what's got Richarlison going.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, Ben, when I think back to that Chelsea game now, which feels like a long time ago, I always feel for Tottenham, for some reason, we always seem to play the name rather than the ever 11 that Chelsea select. And I think that's the most frustrating thing, that, like you said there, in that game, if Spurs keep 11 men on the field, there's only one team winning that game. But there you go. That is the nature of Tottenham in that London derby with Chelsea. I just don't know what that fixture does. It does seem to, every time those two teams get put together, it does seem to boil over one way or another. Right, Ben, look, I think it's fair to say Postecoglou was very clear in the summer that he made it both easy and difficult for the Spurs board with regards to giving them just one main target in each priority position. And it'll be interesting whether that works effectively in January, when, as we know, most clubs have little interest in losing their best players mid-season. Now, since we had the pleasure to last bring you on, Spurs have made a couple of key integral internal appointments, with Scott Munn now starting his role as CEO and Johan Lange as technical director, along with confirmation that Fabio Paratici, for those Spurs fans, is still cooking. He is in the background and remains working for the football club on what we understand to be a consultancy basis. So really keen to know from you, if you can tell us, if you know, Ben, what their dynamic looks like behind the scenes when it comes to the planning of recruitment, because I feel there's a general vibe around the fan base that I think in the summer overall, I'd say 75-80%, everyone was fairly happy with the recruitment. I mean, what do you feel at the moment is happening behind the scenes at Tottenham? Is it all sunshine and roses as we are coming to this January window?
Well, I think all recruitment teams are never sunshine and roses, but it's about a dynamic, and you need a freedom to challenge. So the more you bring in, the more of a healthy debate you want. There's no point in just having yes men and women. And Paratici has obviously historically been very important to Spurs. Udogie was one of the names that he masterminded. So therefore, you have to give him credit because that's paying off. And Tottenham always had very high hopes for Udogie as well. So it's great to see him shining at the moment. But Paratici's been through a difficult time with the ban. And now the consultancy, as I understand it, is more ad hoc. So I don't think we can see Paratici as leading so much as picking up the slack where there is overlap and continuity. And I say where, because it is a big transition from Conte to Postecoglou. But nonetheless, you're working 2-3 windows ahead, and there will be certain targets and bits of business where Paratici's not only opinion, but work previously is relevant to the conversation. And when you're talking to players and agents and clubs, you need that continuity. They don't want to feel like every single conversation is with a different person. And I think Chelsea found this when Todd Boehly was sporting director. Then he stepped back. Then now there's 2 co-sporting directors in Paul Winstanley and Lawrence Stewart doing a really good job of being the face in the market. But there's also Joe Shields. There's Behdad Eghbali, who's very powerful. And then in addition to that, you've still got the manager who will talk to players as well. So the Paratici role has almost been split because he was kind of doing everything in many ways and working with Levy. And we've heard this for a while, but supposedly Levy's stepping back a little bit more and delegating. I think Spurs fans might be dubious about that, but nonetheless, that's the kind of official line. And then Paratici's role has been split, and effectively Scott Munn is doing half of it. Johan Lang, as you say, has come in as technical director. And I still think this recruitment team will build and develop over time. And in the short term, it means that Postecoglou's probably got a little bit more say, because he's come in so early to the formative stages of a recruitment team and model being built. And he's implementing such a distinct philosophy that, of course, his opinion holds more weight, perhaps, than it would have done had he been an older Spurs appointment under a slightly more stable model with some of the names that have now gone. The chief scout, remember, left, and then Gabbiadini was sacked and then came back. So that's another little twist to all of this as well. So you've got a new / old chief scout. You've got a ad hoc / old person in Paratici in ad hoc consultancy. And then everyone else is kind of new. And it's still kind of unclear how hands-on in this window someone like Daniel Levy will be. So add all of that up, and it does seem a little bit fragmented. But what I would say is that Munn has made a very strong impression. And because his start date was delayed, he's had a lot of time to get the lay of the land and start developing relationships. So Paratici, I don't think, is running the show, pulling the strings. I think they're going to him when knowledge is needed and when consultancy is a key component, because maybe he's got the relationships due to pre-existing plans within Spurs, or just within certain regions where he has a lot of say and sway and can be very useful. But I still feel like it's the other names that I've mentioned that are starting to move forwards, and Postecoglou has got a fair amount of say in all of this, which is why, and I'm sure we'll come on to it, when Spurs are looking for a centre-back, Postecoglou's perspective is, let's not let it drag on. Let's not go for one primary target, put all of our eggs in that basket, and then find that in the case of Jean-Claire Debo, they're not going to sell. And then you've wasted your window. And then the other players that you were thinking of maybe feel like they've been second choices. So Postecoglou's perspective in all of this, as you probably see from press conferences as well, is to be very concise, very clear cut, and make a definitive decision. Of course, the rest of the recruitment team need to agree, and some of them might even outrank or outvote him, but his input will be clear and concise. Get it done quickly, be very concise about it, and move on if we think a target's a lost cause. And that's ultimately why, in the context of centre-backs, Dragusin has become this priority, because they obviously feel like they can get that done in the next few days.
Before we do dive into the business that we could be doing in a little bit more detail, I want to ask you quickly, Ben, about the business that we have already done. And I think it's testament to the work that Fabio Paratici has put in. When you look at the jubilance in the Spurs fan base with the 2 contract extensions that have gotten over the line, we saw Pat Matter-Sarr in the last couple of days. It was confirmed that he signed a new deal at the club until 2030, following Destiny Udogie, who signed a deal of the same length. Brilliant deals for Tottenham. And again, 2 players identified and brought in by Paratici. It's brilliant to see the work that he's done actually reaping the rewards for us. Looking at what might happen, Heung-min Son, Giovanni Lo Celso, Rodrigo Bentancur and Yves Bissouma, to name a few, are a couple of players who have only got a couple of years left on their contract. Do you know if Tottenham will be looking to extend any of those contracts?
Yeah, I don't think I'm allowed to say the A word on this show, but another club that happens to be in London went through a sort of flux of contract renewals, and it wouldn't surprise me if Spurs do something relatively similar. I don't think all of the names, from what I'm told, that you've mentioned will be in line for 2024 contracts. Bentancur still has some time on the deal, actually. I think that one is 2026, and I'm not aware of anything starting at this stage with Lo Celso. But I think of the names you mentioned, I would single out Sarr, who we know has already signed, Bissouma and Son. And I think that Bissouma and Son will be next in line as priorities, if you like. The beauty of these kind of renewals is if you feel like the player wants to stay, you can work on them concurrently. Son's going to be a really interesting one because there's lots of interest, particularly from Saudi Arabia. Son dismissed those links last summer. And I think that now he's captain, Spurs fans will feel very calm that not only does he love the club, but he wants to lead the club. So any speculation won't really be of concern. And I would imagine that that will be a relatively simple contract in terms of convincing Son to stay and back the project. But by the same token, there's still finances. There's things like age to consider. There's other players coming in. And it is always just a little bit nervy if somebody like Saudi Arabia comes along because they can just offer a lot of money. And then you might have to not equal that, but counter that to some kind of degree. And this is why Kylian Mbappe spoke very superficially to Saudi and fueled the interest before immediately dismissing it, because you can use it to your advantage. Marco Silva did the same. He signed a new Fulham deal, but prior to that, he spoke very seriously and strongly actually considered a move to Saudi Arabia. And again, he did it because it's part of your decision-making process, but it's leverage as well. Now, all of these Saudi targets, some of them, they have low confidence on. But Son has been on a list of about 20 names for 2024 in Saudi Arabia. And one of the reasons why it was so dismissed by Son is because there was no approach, there was no desire from Saudi to get him in 2023. They didn't think that was possible. So the Son links had emerged because of the fact that he's on this list of 20 for 2024. And now we can kind of compare 2023 to 2024, and we can say how many of the 20 in 2023 did Saudi get from the elite names, the likes of Messi, Neymar, Salah, etc. How many did they get? And it's about 6 or 7, because Ronaldo had already joined. They got Benzema, they got Kante, they got Neymar, they got Sadio Mane, and so on. They got about 7 of the 20. And they knew that 10 of the 20 were maybe less realistic. So Son's on the list, but I think he's on the side of the list that's a bit less realistic. So I think a new deal will be offered to Son. And there's no reason, if things go as they are at the moment, with Son scoring goals and enjoying his football, and actually, ironically, having a bit more freedom, you could argue, with Kane going, that he wouldn't extend. And the other one is Bissouma. I would expect him to be offered a pay rise and a new deal in 2024 as well. So I'm not dismissing the other names and saying that they'll be left out, but I think that you take the contract renewals in phases. And from what I'm told, Bissouma and Son will be the first 2 from the list of names that you put to me that are due new deals and or better terms.
Ben, thank you for that clarity. It feels like there's a process in place at Tottenham. What's going on here? It does happen. It can happen. Right, okay. Look, Ange Postecoglou has admitted that he's hopeful of Spurs getting some new signings through the door early in the January window, but does acknowledge as well that, as always in the window, and Ben knows this better than all of us, that there are plenty of moving parts that, of course, make these deals happen. Now, there's no secret about it. Postecoglou wanted to sign another centre-back in the summer window. That was on top of bringing Mickey van der Ven and teenager Ashley Phillips to the club, but Spurs were unable to get that additional player through the door. And then subsequently, after the English window came to a close, the Australian then agreed to the sale of Davinson Sanchez to Galatasaray, which I think at the time, although there were many that were accepting the fact that maybe Davinson needed to have a new challenge, I think we all knew that up until the point of January, Spurs were leaving themselves very, very short at centre-back. And I feel there has been that feeling of just trying to get to this month so Spurs have the opportunity of bringing somebody in, hopefully of quality. Look, we're going to bring some names into the scene shortly. But Ben, key question I'm going to ask you, we are only day 3. And I joked and said beforehand that I thought there might be a case, I don't know why I did this, that Spurs might have someone in the door before we speak to you. But how confident are you, Ben, that Spurs will act early in this window and bring in this centre-back that ultimately the squad needs? I think as fans, we need for reassurance. How confident are you that's going to happen, Ben?
Pretty confident, to be honest, especially on the centre-back front. I think that Tottenham are advancing and there's a high likelihood that they'll get Dragusin over the line. We can go into that in a little bit more detail when we come onto the centre-backs specifically. But I expect Spurs to be busy in this window if we're speaking generally. We know that they want a centre-back. We know that there's other key positions that they might look to strengthen, and outgoings may play a part in that as well. I think they would still like that creative-minded player that can start in a wide area and cut in. That's going to be very important. So you might call that a wide attacker or a forward or a winger. It just sort of depends on the profile. And then maybe a midfielder as well. And I think those will be the kind of 3 positions. Maybe they won't all get done in January, but 2 of those 3 positions with centre-back being the priority. And I do expect Spurs to move early. And at the same time, I think they need to focus on outgoings and see whether there's any money to be raised. And then late in the window, if they can get outgoings done, they might be able to spend a little bit more. But obviously, if they're going to get Dragusin over the line, it's probably going to cost a minimum of 20 million English pounds. Then on top of that, if you want a wide attacker in the current market, you're going to need 30, 35 million to get Premier League quality at a bare minimum. Were they, and it is an if, we'll come on to this later as well, to move for Conor Gallagher again, as they inquired about and to some extent tried for quite strongly towards the close of the summer window. That's a 45 to 60 million type outlay if you include the guaranteed fee and the bonuses as well. So even if you're sort of adding it all up and trying to stay on the cheap side in the modern market and with only a month to get your work done, those kind of 3 signings for those 3 positions would cost you collectively something in the region of 100 million quid. And I think that would be very difficult for Spurs. So they're going to have to be economical. They're going to have to consider outgoings. But I do think that where they will move quickly and confidently in the earlier part of the window is on this number 1 priority, which is bringing in a centre-back.
Yep, that's absolutely fine. Matt, I'll hand over to you just so we can clarify positional-wise where Spurs are, just in relation to maybe what their positions they'll look to target in this window.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you mentioned a couple of there, Ben. As I think has been one of the worst kept secrets in football. It is the centre back that is a priority for Tottenham. And again, we'll get on to names very, very shortly. But you mentioned the other 2 positions there, midfield and some sort of profile of forward. Is that, do you think, maybe a definitive list for Tottenham, or is there something else that we might be exploring in the coming weeks?
No, I think that's the sort of definitive senior list. And unless there's any opportunism in the market, I don't see it changing. Of course, if you can get a player in midfield that can play centrally and wide, then to an extent you can get a 2-for-1. But I feel like the wide attacker is more orientated towards goals than necessarily only versatility and creativity. So when you have a player, for example, like Cole Palmer, even though he scored a bunch of goals for Chelsea, he can play centrally, he can float out wide, he can go false 9, he can go number 10, he can drop into attacking midfield. He gives you the ability to run all over a front line in a 4-2-3-1. But he's obviously not the same as, let's say, a Dominic Solanke or any other wide type forward that is used to playing in a 4-3-3. For example, Anthony Gordon would be a good example. They're not the same profile as Cole Palmer. So if Maddison comes back, Tottenham almost needs to determine, do we want more of an out-and-out goal scorer, or are they going to wait and then in summer look to, in inverted commas, replace Kane, which I think is quite likely? in which case they might want someone that can chip in with a few goals, but from wider areas, but not necessarily lead the line, especially because Richarlison at the moment is doing really well. Son can also play in that position. Let's not forget you've got Manuel Solomon, who will eventually return, and he's an asset and somebody that can add goals as well. So it's quite a difficult one, because if you're Postecoglou inputting, it might be different for the recruitment team. You almost want everyone fit, because if you rush in January before they're fit, you might buy a duplicate, you might buy someone you don't need, and it may be better to reserve those funds and then attack the market in the summer, which is a much easier window for buyers. January is ultimately a seller's market. And then if they move for others, we might see some young players, some squad players, ones for the future, because clubs are always concurrently signing for the tomorrow as well as the today. And if you can do both at once, it's great, but maybe they'll try one or two that they either loan out or are much, much younger in their mid or late teens. That obviously is always a priority as well, as you look to kind of win that battle to get the best possible youth as well. But I think if we're being really broad and trying to sort of hide these names for questions that are coming in the second half, then we're looking at some kind of wide attacker that can offer creativity, then a midfielder, and then obviously the centre-back, as we've already discussed. And then when you get to the summer, it might be that if they've succeeded in that, the priorities change. But I think summer will be a bit more specific. I think they will want a Dominic Solanke type profile, or they want to enter the race for an Ivan Toney should he become available. I'm not saying that they are concrete Spurs targets, although Solanke has certainly been inquired about. But the point of saying those names is that you know who they are, you know where they play, and you expect a certain output of double figures in goals. So there's a much clearer vision than saying to Maddison or that type of profile exactly what you want, because you're expecting them to pull the strings, you're expecting them to dictate the pace, you're expecting them to feed others, you're expecting them to take free kicks, and you're expecting them to score goals. So how do you weight the sort of KPIs? Because you want absolutely everything from those players, and you might ask them to play in different positions. Whereas I think that in the summer, there'll be less of a kind of versatility demand and less of a stopgap demand and less urgency to fill the squad because of all the injuries. And there'll be a much clearer purpose of, once again, we've got 3 odd months and we need X, Y, and Z. And they're much more rigid players in rigid positions. And I think that's the challenge of January. It's a short window. And even Tottenham probably don't know exactly what they want, because so many players are injured that you want the quality and you want who's available, and not everyone's available, and you want versatile players because you're worried that the injuries are going to continue. And this is what makes it a really challenging month for Spurs.
It does. It most certainly does. Look, Ben has teed out very, very nicely. What we are going to do, we are going to go for our first break of the show for our listeners on audio. When we come back, it is the names you've all been waiting for that are going to be targeted and handed to Mr. Jacobs to give us his view as to where they are in this window. I want to say, as always, thank you so much for all your incredible support for Last One on Spurs. We've got over 1,000 plus of you watching us live on all our platforms. So again, thank you so much for all your incredible support for the show. I'm joined by my co-host. Look, we're kickstarting January always in a special way. We're joined by Matty Hayes, and we're joined by the brilliant Ben Jacobs, TalkSport's very own, of course, brilliant sports journalist that we have the pleasure of bringing on, of course, when the window... Does it fly open, Ben? I don't know if that's the right term. Fly open. We always wonder, does it slam shut? Does it slush slowly? Who knows? But it is open now. We are open for business. Spurs are most certainly open for business. Before we get Ben's thoughts on genuine players Spurs are going to bring in this window, just a reminder here on Last One on Spurs that we are delighted to be sponsored by Beer Passport. Let me tell you a little bit about our new sponsor. Everyone likes a beer, and if you don't, there's a good chance you'll know someone who does. Beer Passport features 70 unique tap rooms around London where you can get yourself an exclusive offer at each one you visit, like buy one, get one free. 50% off a flight of beer or even a free pint. You'll be drinking the freshest beers directly from the source, and you'll get a stamp at each tap room you visit, just like your own passport. So if you're partial to a pre-match pint, Beer Passport has several local brewery tap rooms near the Tottenham Hotspur ground, including Beavertown Aura and Redemption Breweries. There are 5 tap rooms on the Black Horse Beer Mile, which is one tube stop away, which could make for a great pre-match tap room crawl. Beer Passport is the perfect for those looking to find somewhere to drink before the match, and for those that like to get out and about, of course, on non-match days and away days. So please head to beerpassport.co.uk and use that code LDUS Beer for 20% off a passport. That code again, LDUS Beer, 20% off for a passport. Right, Ben, it is name time. And if I don't start at this man, I'm not sure what's going to happen. For those that are watching us, I feel the audience might combust if I don't mention the man. So look, you brought him up very, very briefly. It appears that Spurs are reportedly in advanced talks with Genoa over a deal for the Romanian defender Radu Dragusin, who has emerged as Spurs' preferred target after negotiations seemingly stalled over the French defender Jean-Claire Todibo. Now, there has been rumours that Napoli are also interested in the 21-year-old. But again, I'll say this until you confirm it. Reportedly, Spurs have agreed already personal terms with the centre-back and are in the process of discussing the final fee with Genoa. Tell us, to your knowledge, if you know this is Spurs' number one target, and how confident are you that this deal does get done imminently?
Spurs are optimistic. The talks are going well. I think the Napoli aspect is a red herring. It's not to say that they're not interested, but the key thing here is that Dragusin wants Spurs and has, as you rightly say, to my knowledge, agreed personal terms. So when the player wants the move and has delayed signing a new deal, which many people thought was going to happen prior to these negotiations, it tells you that Tottenham have got a lot of leverage in this negotiation. And the parties are not massively far apart in price. But of course, structure is always the thing that's forgotten in these deals. I think a lot of the time people hear, oh, Genoa want X, roughly 30 million euros, let's say, and Spurs are 6 or 7 million euros shy of that. And fans sometimes can't understand why it is that they don't just meet halfway. Oh, it's only 3 million. And I know that sounds really glib, but in the context of transfer markets and big football clubs, 3 million is not a lot of money. But it's also about structure. It's about payment terms. It's about bonuses. So you could say 30 million, but you could structure that as 15 million in bonuses only if Spurs win the Champions League in the next 3 years. And Genoa may say, we've not got that much confidence we're going to get the money. Or you could say it's only 20 million euros, which sounds like too low, but it's all up front. It's in 1 or 2 payments. It's very preferable. Maybe if there's bonuses, they're really attainable. So structure is really important as well. But as I reported a few days ago, Tottenham are looking to do this deal at 17 to 20 million pounds. So that's under 25 million euros. And Genoa want something in the region of 30 million euros, but there's still a confidence that they'll come down. And again, the parties are not that far apart. My last update was at lunch today, so it may have even moved, but the latest that I have is that talks took place today and they were again very positive, and Tottenham still want to get an agreement in principle done before the week is out, which tells you that they want to try and get Dragusin as soon as possible, which plays again into your earlier question of, are Spurs going to move early and get business done? Well, yes, if they possibly can on the centre-back front. I think with Napoli, I wouldn't downplay the fact that they like the player, but I would say when you suddenly start to hear there's another suitor and that's coupled with maybe Genoa want 35 million, it's usually alarm bells that signal gamesmanship, because suddenly Genoa have changed the dynamic and they've gone from Spurs thinking they're going to get it done for 25 million euros or under to there's another suitor. Now we want 30 to 35 million, and that can be used as a tactic. So of course you're going to get a situation where Genoa say other clubs are interested. And of course that leads to a fear that there might be a twist. But at the moment it's in Spurs' hands and they are confident that they can get this deal done. With Todibo, as I reported last week, Spurs were always pessimistic. So there was a lot of clamour because there's no doubt that he is hugely admired by many in the Spurs hierarchy. And in an ideal world, could probably be termed a few months back as a top target, which is why they explored that deal first. But when they opened the talks, they realised that Nice don't want to sell. And in addition to that, to turn their head and maybe change their mind, it's 60 million euros or something like that. Whereas Dragusin may be done for 25 million euros, which means that if you've got that 60 million euros, you can bring in a second player. And that's what Spurs need to do, strengthen in multiple areas. So that's why the focus has shifted to Dragusin. And Postecoglou made the point, again, he's not the only voice, but he's an important one, that he doesn't want this to drag out and then find by January the 20th, January the 25th, he's got no centre-backs and he's sweating. Tottenham want someone through the door and quickly and at value, and then that should allow them to have the funds, especially if they have outgoings, to bring in at least one more.
Ben, I want to ask just a follow-up one on him. Look, I don't know too much about the guy, being honest with you. I've done a little bit of research from what I can see. Look, it seems that he's extremely quick over a short distance. I'd liken it, of course, to the same way Mickey van der Ven's stature, posture is as a player. If Spurs do get this deal over the line, any idea you can kind of tell us what kind of player Spurs will be getting?
Absolutely. He's a really exciting young centre-back. You're absolutely right in what you say. He's very quick. And by being quick, it means not just physical speed, but also speed of thought as well. And one of his most underrated qualities, if you watch videos, because you'll see a lot on sort of YouTube or in matches of him pinging long balls, and he is actually a very precise passer. And that can be very useful if you want to play on the counter-attack, or if teams are not pressing Spurs and he has time, you'll see a lot of diagonals that could set off the likes of Son or Richarlison or Maddison when he's fit and so on. So if you're playing fantasy football, put him in, because you might get the odd assist here and there with these long passes, even though he's a centre-back, not a full-back, and the full-backs are the ones that tend to get more points. But the most underrated quality, and I think his most impressive aspect, is actually how clever he is out of possession and the manner in which he uses his speed to either recover or cover for others, and the way in which he can kind of go from centre back to almost, if needed, like an old school sweeper and mop up the ball is going to be really useful. Because what we're seeing at the moment, and to his credit, he's doing it fantastically, is Vicario sensing the danger, playing sweeper keeper, coming very quickly out of his box. And he's been such an effective and impressive signing for Spurs. But when you have a player like Dragusin, it means that he will also at times linger and hold back. And because Spurs are playing such a high line, it's quite dangerous, because you obviously don't want one player that is playing everyone else on side. But what you do want, if you're going to play a high line, is you want everybody to stay in that system and then have the speed for him to be able to get back and gain yardage and mop up. And I think he's very aware of when balls are coming through, and he's very fast and able to recover. So that's going to be very useful to Spurs, because we know they play risk reward. We know they play that high line. And if he can get back with his pace, because of his positioning and his speed, that's going to be a really useful asset. So you'll see a lot, like I say, about aerially winning duels, composure on the ball, personality and maturity. These are all true. But I think what really makes him a standout defender is his fit within this Spurs system and the work that he does and the intelligence that he shows off the ball.
Ben, thank you for that clarity. I must say as well, I mean, we saw that image that has been doing the rounds on social media. Of course, it looks like there's been, as we said earlier, a bit of parategy cooking in the background there. Of course, there's been the images of Dragusin that's been pictured with the likes of Bentancur and Kulusevski through their time at Juve. And look, I mean, bearing in mind, we saw Parategy go back and raid Juve for Bentancur and Kulusevski. If he's anywhere near the quality of those two, fingers crossed Spurs are getting an absolute star. And I think, Ben, look, your analysis there will give Spurs fans, I feel, a lot of confidence, a lot of optimism if Spurs do get the deal over the line. I'm going to hand over to Matt, who I know has got a number of names to fire at you that also have been linked with Spurs defensive-wise.
Yeah, I suppose we're kind of half asking this in the off chance that something goes wrong with the Dragusin deal, and half if there may potentially be another player being brought in. But I was going to list off a few names, Ben, that have been linked with Spurs over the last couple of weeks or months. There's Tosin Adarabioyo of Fulham, who was a target that we definitely had in the summer. Mark Gahey, who's a name that's kind of not gone away with Spurs. There's Lloyd Kelly, Jared Branthwaite and Joe Gomez. Outside of the Premier League, there's been some links to Aruna Sangante, Sebastian Cáceres, Morato, Koki Makita, Gonçalo Inacio, and even before he went to Bournemouth, Ilya Zabarny as well. Is there any name there that you think Tottenham might have their eye on for this window?
Yeah, I think from that list, there's a few that are more actively considered. As you say, Zabarny, a historical target compared to, say, Lloyd Kelly and even Mark Gahey, that may be a little bit more active. Gahey's really difficult to get from Crystal Palace. And I think that Chelsea are across that one as well. Gonzalo Ignacio is on the Spurs list, not an easy one or a cheap signing to make. So these could be names that are revisited in the next kind of 2 or 3 windows. Or, as you say, if anything happens where Dragusin falls through, they might have to look at another target. I think that Tosin and Lloyd Kelly might be possible at the right number. January potentially, and certainly summer 2024. I don't think there's too much there with Spurs and Joe Gomez. And I think that with Sangante, they looked and decided against moving. I would also still add Max Kilman to the mix as well. I know that we spoke about this. We seem to talk about him on every single show. He's not gone away either. And there was a new deal signed at Wolves, but there's a few clubs looking and wondering whether a ball-playing defender like him could be of value with Premier League experience. So there's nothing that's advanced there. There's nothing that's active there at the moment. It might be one that's more for the summer, but that's a name that's not gone away either. But I think that if Dragusin was to not happen because an agreement is not reached, then Tosin and Lloyd Kelly might, from the names that you've given, be 2 to watch. I think that Spurs would have been far more aggressive with Ignacio if they thought that they could get him at value. But that's just one that might require your entire January budget. They may also need an outgoing to finance that kind of deal. So if Spurs, as I said before, can bring in 2 players for 50, 60 million at a max, they'll be relatively happy. But if they have to spend that kind of fee or close to it on only one player, it might be at the expense of needing to sell, or it might mean they only bring one in January. So I think it's normal in the early part of the window to look for a simpler deal and look for a quick deal that you really feel is the right fit, but also the right value, because then you save yourself the time and the funds to focus for the rest of the window on seeing what else is possible. If you just spend big and don't assess options and don't take your time and don't use the early part of the window to your advantage to negotiate, then yes, you might get in a name early, but you might run out of funds and then you might not use the window as effectively as you would have liked. So I think, as we said before, fans will say, it's January the 3rd, why haven't we already signed a centre-back? But it's also possible that Spurs are trying to kind of spin more than one plate to make sure that they make exactly the right decision, both in terms of fit and also value as well. And if they take a couple of extra days to do that, especially with like FA Cup and Premier League action still not for 10 days or so, Ange Postecoglou will still believe that he's got enough time to integrate the player and use him effectively towards the back end of the month and onwards. So I do think it's quite smart that Spurs are seemingly not rushing, but I also think at the moment that Dragusin is the clear focus, and a lot of these other names, although linked and looked at, have as a result, for now anyway, taken a back seat.
Matty, I'm going to be a real pain. Just one thing I've got to ask, Ben, because this listener, very kindly viewer, brings this up on Dragusin, just how much this man backs himself. Because look, he's coming in, Ben, to a side that have got Mickey van der Ven and Romero established as arguably, I think, one of the best centre-back pairings in defence. And I'm really intrigued to ask you, what does it say about Dragusin that he feels confident enough that he wants to come to Spurs, where necessarily he may not be the automatic first choice in a defensive partnership? Now, look, we may argue the fact that Romero normally tends to get himself suspended every couple of months, so there'll be plenty of games up anyway, and fingers crossed Spurs have got Champions League football next season. But how much does that say, Ben, about the player, that he backs himself? Because you know, Ben, look, covering the window, there's plenty of players that will not go to a football club unless they are guaranteed some form of first team football. So how big is that by all accounts we understand the player is very, very keen on the move to Spurs, and there's no guarantee he will be a first choice centre back?
Yeah, I think he's 21. Romero's 25, so not going anywhere. But Romero also has the hamstring strain and is probably out for at least another month. So it's a good time to join because you get the opportunity to show what you can do, to play. And then it goes back on Romero to sort of force his way back into the side. And although I take your point that Van der Ven and Romero together have developed an effective partnership, I think before Van der Ven, and going back a little bit further, Romero was dividing the fan base. He wasn't necessarily as consistent. He seems to be thriving under Ange Postecoglou. So there's always a chance that you can oust somebody like that. And in addition, your centre-backs are, I think, a little bit more easy to rotate than in other positions. So although we'd sort of associate teams doing well with constantly picking a consistent back four, if you look at Manchester United, who have had horrible luck with their own centre-backs, they've still been able to bring in the likes of Harry Maguire, who is much maligned, and he's done really well. They've played Johnny Evans, and he's got game time as well. So clubs seem to want 3 or 4 senior centre-backs that they can almost rotate. And even if you are number 3 on paper in that pecking order, I still think as a centre-back, you'd be relatively confident in getting 20 odd appearances. And then if Spurs can qualify for Europe, even more so next season. And when you're 21 years of age, I think you're happy with that. I don't think it's unambitious to come to Spurs and say, I'm going to try at 21 and get straight into that starting 2. But if I don't, I'm going to play 20 odd games in my first full season, or 10 odd games between now and the end of this season, and then 20 odd games next season. And then I'll be 22, 23. And that's when I'll start really making a claim to spend 5, 6, 7 years as a regular stalwart within Tottenham's starting 11. So I don't think Dragusin is really thinking about the move as something that has to happen overnight. But also think about, again, down the road. I refuse to name them on the podcast, but again, the other club, if you like, when William Saliba was loaned back originally, Arsenal also had an established centre-back pairing, and everybody was absolutely raving about it. And nobody thought at that point that Saliba would just be dropped straight into the starting 11 and hold the place from day one. And now he's indispensable. So Dragusin just might surprise some Spurs fans. And it's obviously a very welcome situation for Postecoglou to be in, to have the options. But I don't think that he's put off because he feels like he's behind anybody in the pecking order. I just think it's an opportunity to develop at still a young age and then see whether he can force his way when everybody's fit into that starting 11.
I think as well, if you want to look at it through the same lens as Ange Postecoglou, one of my favourite quotes that he's come out with since coming into Spurs, when he was asked about the crazy prices that you're seeing in the transfer market at the moment, he said that in his personal opinion, the drop-off between the best of the best and the next level isn't really that much. And maybe that little bit of extra quality is what you're paying for. But I think he probably looks at this as 3 centre-backs who are ready for now. And I'm sure if that's the way he sees it, he's told Dragusin as much. So I think Postecoglou will. We know how good he is at convincing these players to come in, and I've personally have no kind of qualms about maybe the mentality that it shows from Dragusin. But moving outside of defence, Ben, and as you mentioned earlier, Spurs are continuing to look for a centre midfielder, and will allow Pierre-Emile Hojbjerg to leave only if we do manage to get one in, as we're short of options there with Sarr and Basuma at AFCON, as we mentioned earlier in the show. How likely do you think it is that we will see Hojbjerg move on in this window?
Yeah, I think Hojbjerg is somebody that Spurs will look at as wanting off the books. They certainly won't stand in the way. And we know that there's new interest from Italy, and Juventus could be one to watch here. The situation, I think, with Hojbjerg is that ever since he changed agents relatively recently, I think it was back in September, it was clear that he's wanted out. And it's now about Spurs finding a solution. And as I said earlier, if Tottenham are to fund this business, outgoings are going to be important. So if they are going to allow Hojbjerg to go to another club, then they ideally want a permanent transfer with a fee right now. If they can't, it will have to be a loan, but with an obligation to buy. But there's no chance that Spurs are just going to let Hojbjerg go to Juventus on loan, take a small loan fee, get some or all of the wages off the books, and then revisit it in the summer. They want to push right now to get money in. And that, I think, could be quite difficult for Juventus because we know that their finances are relatively tight. And then away from Juventus, I don't think anymore we're really keeping an eye on Atleti. But what I do know is that Diego Simeone was really disappointed that they were not able to sign Hojbjerg last summer. And when we last spoke, I think I made the point at that time that talks were becoming really quite advanced in the last window, and Atleti were relatively confident of agreeing a fee. And then suddenly Spurs upped the price and wanted about 10 million more, and it wasn't within Atleti's budget. And Hojbjerg still isn't within their budget. And they think they're wasting their time returning and asking for a loan, because they're well aware of Spurs' position, that there has to be a permanence to the transfer. It has to be a permanent sale, or it has to be a loan with an obligation to buy. And at the moment, that is creating a little bit of a stalemate. So I do think that there is a possibility that Hojbjerg goes to Juventus. There's a few other Italian clubs taking a look as well, but it's all just going to depend on whether Spurs can get the number, because if they can't get a permanent sale, they're not just going to loan for the sake of loaning, or reducing squad size, or reducing wage bill, or taking a small loan fee. They really, because they know the player would like to leave, or at least that's the message coming from those close to the player and on the agent side. So they want this resolved rather than lingering. And they know that there's enough interest. Napoli are another, I think, Italian club along with Juventus, that hopefully this is the window where they will get something concrete that works for all parties. And obviously, if that happens, they won't stand in the player's way.
In terms of a name who could potentially become an in to replace Hojbjerg, if we do get that sale this month, Chelsea's Conor Gallagher is one that isn't going away, and Tottenham are continuing to monitor the uncertain situation. Do you think Pochettino would really allow one of his most important players and his deputy captain, if you like, to leave the club in a January transfer window to a London rival?
Well, it's not really Pochettino's choice. I think that there's a few reports out there suggesting that somehow Pochettino has enhanced say in this window, and that's not my understanding. Pochettino is a vital voice, an important voice, but he's one of many. And Pochettino is only on a 2-year guaranteed contract at Chelsea, so he's thinking about the now, naturally. And at the end of this season, there'll almost be an appraisal, a two-way conversation, as Chelsea's senior leadership and Pochettino move forwards into that second guaranteed year. And then there's a third year on the contract, but that is only a club option, so it's out of Pochettino's control. So, of course, Pochettino's position is Gallagher's his captain at the moment. He's one of Chelsea's best players, probably second only behind Cole Palmer. His actual name captain, Reece James, is injured, having undergone surgery, and Ben Chilwell's been sidelined, who's the vice captain. So Postecoglou feels that he could gain someone in Gallagher that adds leadership and fills the midfield void, especially if Hojbjerg leaves. But ultimately, Pochettino is thinking more, I need a guy that's captaining this team. I need a guy that's the midfield engine room. I need a guy that's in form. And Gallagher would ideally like to stay as well. So it becomes quite complicated, really. And some Spurs fans might have been across the Mason Mount saga, which was also complicated. And there's parallels only in the sense that Mount was heading into the final year of his contract. Chelsea's position is, if your contract is winding down and it's heading into the final year, you're for sale, because they want a situation where they can cash in. And in Gallagher's case, it's pure profit on the books. So there's a financial consideration, there's an FFP consideration, there's a contract winding down consideration, that all for the right price could trump the player wanting to stay and could trump the perspective of only Pochettino. So we need to be careful with this, because yes, it's true, Pochettino doesn't want Gallagher to go. And yes, it's true, Gallagher would like a new deal at Chelsea on the right terms and wants to fight for his place. But it was also true that Lewis Hall wanted to stay at Chelsea. He signed a 6-year deal, and a week later, he went to Newcastle. So things can change. And just because a player wants to stay, it doesn't also mean that they don't not want Spurs. And at this stage, there's not two offers to compare. There's one potential, and there's the club where Gallagher's currently at and whom he's captaining. So it's not a disrespect to Spurs to say that Gallagher wants to stay at Chelsea, and he won't really have a clear perspective unless a concrete Spurs offer materialises. So over the weekend, we saw reports in Italy that suggested that Spurs were starting talks with Chelsea. That's not my understanding. I'm told that there's no formal talks between Gallagher, Chelsea and Spurs at this point. There's only the history towards the back end of the last window, and there's the admiration. But Spurs felt like 35 million was as high as they were prepared to go in the back end of the last window. And now, if they're to succeed with Gallagher, you're looking at a minimum guaranteed fee of 45 million. And there'll be bonuses on top of that. And there's less time on the contract. So Chelsea have almost inflated the hypothetical price for Gallagher without quoting a specific number. So should a suitor come calling, internally, if a number is triggered, they'll say this is in our interest to sell. And if it isn't, they're not going to force Gallagher out. So I think that if Tottenham want to proceed, they're probably going to have to drop that minimum of 45 million plus bonuses. And the total package could be 55 million or even 60 million, which is nearly twice the price that they were considering only a few months ago. And when you spell it out like that, it all looks a bit unlikely. Of course, the flip side is, are Chelsea playing gamesmanship? And because they need the pure profit and because they need the outgoings and because they want to finance some kind of elite striker either in January or the summer, are they going to come down? And do they appreciate that the price is too inflated? We'll have to wait and see. But to get to that point, Spurs have to initiate talks. And at the moment, I'm not aware of any new formal talks between Spurs and Chelsea for Conor Gallagher, even though the admiration is clear. And even though Pochettino does like Gallagher, nothing has actually moved at this point. And we'll have to wait and see whether that changes during the window.
Ben, I find it fascinating. I know you've got really, really good knowledge, of course, of Chelsea as well. I know there's a lot of Chelsea fans that are avidly watching us at the moment and wondering whether the future of their vice-captain is up in the air at the moment. One thing I do want to ask you before I bring Matt back in is that, look, I think I've asked you about this before, that when you look back at Spurs and Chelsea's business that have been done together, I think we have to go back now to, I believe, 2001, where Gustavo Poyet moved from Chelsea to Tottenham. That's how long ago it has been since those two boardrooms have done business. Now, look, of course, there has been an ownership change at Chelsea, a subsequently big one that ultimately you feel could impact the way in which the two clubs may do business in the future. Do you think, Ben, now that you will see Spurs and Chelsea do future business, whether it's for Gallagher or not, do you feel that now, whatever happened in the past with Abramovich, that's kind of the past and the future with Bowley and Levy? And could you actually see there being business done between the two football clubs?
I can. I think it's a good question and a very valid point, and obviously one that fans might debate more than boardrooms. If business is business and it's the right kind of business, then I think the Chelsea ownership anyway would have no concerns about doing business with Spurs. And I think that Daniel Levy is also very dispassionate in this context. And if it's the right kind of value and price, then the history and the rivalry between the clubs probably wouldn't get in the way. And it's a strange one, isn't it? Because there's been so much overlap, even though they've not been like direct poachings or anything. There's been so much overlap between managers that have gone Spurs, Chelsea, Chelsea, Spurs, but very little in terms of direct business on the player side. And obviously the reason for that is just because the managers have ended up at those clubs, but they've not all been at one club and then gone directly to the other. So I think that there's this real fixation of the London rivalry, and there's this notion that you can't do business in the same way that the two Manchester clubs can't do business. And I really don't think that Bedag Eghbali and Todd Bowley view it that way. They've got a lot of respect for Spurs and their model, and they've got a desire to do what's right for their club financially if they're selling, and from a football perspective if they're buying. And they're not going to not try just because it's Spurs. And I think if Kane was available to a Premier League club, then Chelsea absolutely would have felt like they could have done business. Maybe Levy would have had other ideas. I was having this conversation with someone the other day, and I was pointing out that hindsight allows you to see the buy and move. And if you're Manchester United and you look at what they spent on Rasmus Højlund, you maybe say, well, how on earth did you not at least place a bid? But the Levy price and the Levy negotiation for Manchester United would have been completely different to the Levy price and the Levy negotiation for Bayern. Because imagine the outrage at Spurs if Kane had scored 25 goals in 25 games for Manchester United, that would have probably had them top of the table right now if you added those 25 goals, given that Højlund's barely scored any. And then you're saying, what are Spurs doing? We've been weakened, and now look at Manchester United. Because the distance between leagues and because of Kane's desire for a fresh challenge, I think Levy negotiated differently. But if he was available and genuinely said, Premier League clubs come calling, it's the same price, it's the same deal for all of you, it's up to Kane, then I think at that point, Chelsea absolutely would have tried their luck. From people I speak to anyway, I think the other thing is that Todd Boehly tried to buy Spurs. Let's not forget that. And before Chelsea. So he knows a fair amount about the club, its culture, its fan base. He did an element of due diligence, even though it didn't advance to the kind of formal due diligence or exclusive due diligence. And there's a fair few others within the Chelsea hierarchy that are extremely familiar with Tottenham. And as a result of all of that, the cordiality between the two clubs at boardroom level is a lot different to how the fans see it. And that's why I think that there would be no problems the two clubs doing business, certainly not in the context of Conor Gallagher, if Spurs chose to make a competitive offer.
I find it fascinating, Ben, just to close on Gallagher, because I think there's one that most certainly you can understand why he would be a player that Ange would love. He's got a really, really good solid engine on him, if I can put it in the most basic term. I think that's the kind of player that Ange would absolutely love to have in the side in terms of there being a squad player. I think, again, you look at the fact that it takes a homegrown element to it. English-based players seem to love working with English players. I just wonder, I mean, look, you spelt out there the kind of fee or the region of it that Spurs would have to go to get that kind of player. Do you think realistically that kind of money would Spurs look to splash it out in this kind of window? It just feels that maybe more one for the summer. Am I maybe putting two and two, giving it in 5 there?
No, I don't think so. I think that if it is as high as 60 million all in or 55 million, then Spurs don't move. And maybe that's why they haven't moved. You haven't got time to waste your time in January. So if you know that that's going to be the ballpark and you feel it's 10, 15 million too high, then you're going to wait and then see whether or not Gallagher signs a new deal. And if he doesn't, then there's a real window of opportunism to get him for far closer to 35 million in the summer. And at that point, the player may realize he's not going to get a new deal and have a different perspective about wanting to leave. The thing about Chelsea's midfield is right now, because Reece James is injured, as I said before, and Ben Chilwell's the vice captain and he's been out, Gallagher's being picked as captain and as a form player. But it's a 4-2-3-1 and Caicedo on form warrants a spot. Enzo on form warrants a spot. Lavia, when fit, on form, or if he lives up to his potential, warrants a spot. So there might not be room for Conor Gallagher, if we're being brutally honest, and when Chelsea have got more of their senior leaders back on the field. And then Gallagher can go box to box and play in a more advanced position, but he's ultimately a central midfielder. And in a 4-2-3-1, ahead of him is Nkunku, and Gallagher's not taking that place, or ahead of him could be Cole Palmer, he's not taking that place. And then to the left and to the right, he's not that type of wide midfielder. So he sort of has to play as the holding midfielder in Pochettino's system. And I think that if everyone was fit, everyone was bedded in and everyone was settled, you're probably picking Caicedo and Enzo Fernandez. And then it's almost a battle between Lavia and Gallagher for the other spot. So that might be running through Chelsea's mind. And this is partially why, for the right number, they might be prepared to sell. But I'd be very surprised if the price is as high as 60 million if Tottenham advance anything on Conor Gallagher.
Looking at another couple of midfield names that are out there, Ben, Tottenham are reportedly set to present a proposal to sign Belgian midfielder Stanis Adumbo-Muzambo from Ajax. He's decided to turn down any new contract bid from Ajax, and he is just one of a number of midfield targets that happen out there for Tottenham at the moment. There's Ko Itakura, Arthur Vermeeren, Rooney Bargy, Adam Morton, Calvin Phillips, and Matthias Sola. Do you know if there's any genuine interest from Spurs in any of these names? And again, what's the sort of timeline on this?
Yeah, I don't have information on all of these. I've made a few inquiries. I'm not sure that there's a great deal in Calvin Phillips to Spurs, but we know that he needs game time. The problem with Calvin Phillips is just that Manchester City want a loan with an obligation to buy, or if it is to be a straight loan, which is not their preference, it's a really high fee. And I don't think that Spurs will see any value in that. But again, Phillips is a midfielder and to some extent follows the profile of Gallagher. So they may want to strengthen in that position. I think Mazambo is the most concrete because Spurs actually are putting together a proposal, but they face competition from Sevilla. And the feeling at the moment, talking to sources, is that Sevilla might be a little bit more aggressive and could even be a little bit more ahead in that race at the moment. So we wait and see how that progresses. There might be a sale in January, or there might be a pre-agreement, because I think from memory, he becomes a free agent in June anyway. So there's a few considerations here. And from Spurs' point of view, it might be one to watch, therefore, for the summer rather than January. I am not aware with Rooney, or I think the other one that you mentioned was Itakura, too much that's advanced. But what's absolutely true with Itakura is that he's been scouted. So scouting doesn't really mean advancing or bidding, but it means that you're there on the radar. It means they're aware of the player. So that could be one to watch for Spurs. Nothing advanced there. I think that Mazambo is going to actually turn into a formal proposal, whereas I think that Itakura is being looked at. And there's other Premier League clubs in the mix there as well. With Itakura, I would keep a strong eye on Liverpool as well. So there is some substance to some of these names for sure. But this is a reflection, the volume of names, of the need of Spurs because of the fact they've had injuries and they're building a new project and they need depth, coupled with the fact that you've got a new recruitment team with new ideas, coupled with the fact that you've got a new style compared to Conte, coupled with the fact that everyone's also planning ahead to the summer. So I think that some of these names are going to rear themselves again in a positive way as we head into the summer window, but are probably not all attainable as far as January is concerned.
Ben, thank you as always for that concise breakdown there. What we are going to do, we are going to go for our final break of the show for our listeners and audience. A good 1,400 of the year watching us live again. Thank you so much for all your incredible support for Last Word on Spurs. I'm joined by my brilliant co-host, Matty Hayes. Matty Hayes back on Last Word on Spurs. Of course, the window is formally open, and we're joined by TalkTalk's very own, the brilliant, look, he's been on this show many, many times. He passes the exam with flying colours. He talked about sitting the exam earlier. He passes it every time. Everyone loves having this man on. We've got the brilliant Ben Jacobs joining us here. Look, you guys know what I'm going to say now. Contra time. Strike off your bingo cards. We are entering into our, I feel, extra time here with Ben. So we're going to try and up the pace. I used to make that joke, we'd be upping the pace like Adama Traore. He definitely is not on Spurs' list of targets. I think for once, Ben, right? No Adama Traore on the list of targets for Tottenham.
Not that I'm aware.
I always make that joke. We're going to try and up the tempo. I'm going to hand back to Matt to close this final part of the show. Matty, over to you.
I think the majority of the people in the chat have been waiting for this one. It's a name that I've seen thrown in there quite a bit during the show. But Ben, like you mentioned earlier on, with the position, Spurs are also keen to bring in a forward, a versatile attacker who can play out wide or through the centre. Although this player is less of a central forward and more of a left winger, the links with Postecoglou's former Celtic attacker Jota are persisting. Do you know if there is a genuine interest in the player? And if so, could we see him come through the door this window?
I would downplay the Jota links at the moment, although he may be available at value. But Jota's had this terrible time at Al Ittihad. He's had managerial change and he's still not really got game time. It looked like he might be forced out within a matter of months when Nuno was still in charge. And now Gallardo's the manager. He's been included a little bit, but he's effectively a squad player. And he doesn't seem happy with that. He moved for big money. It hasn't worked out. So there is a possibility that he becomes available in the market. But I would counter that by saying, contrary to some reports, when I speak to Saudi deal makers, they make it clear that they're not in this rush. So we're reading a lot of reports about Ittihad want him out. Ittihad are looking to force the sale, to resolve it in January. Not necessarily. Don't be surprised if it gets resolved in the summer. I'm not saying that January is out of the question, but Al Ittihad are out the Club World Cup. That's passed. They're, I think, 7th in the league, so they're not competing for a title. They will predominantly be focused on the local market themselves in January because their seasonal budget is spent. And even though there's lots of Saudi money, 17 billion allocated for the Saudi Pro League between now and 2030, it's seasonal. And Etihad spent their budget in the summer window, and they still may try and wait and request extra money for a really box office name. And that will come again in the summer. So they don't need to really worry about Jota going now, because to my knowledge, there's not another foreign star waiting in the wings to come in January, but there might be at the end of the season. And then you have to think about the optics as well. And it's the same for Firmino at Al Ahly as well. If these players go mid-season after only 6 months, then what kind of message does that send to other players considering a move to the Saudi Pro League? And even though the club are not thinking that way and the manager are not thinking that way at Al Ittihad, these deals are complicated, and the Ministry of Sport and PIF and wider deal makers and partners are definitely looking at the optics of Jota, not only the club concerns over him. So I think at this stage, it's a neat link to make because of Postecoglou and Jota at Celtic, and he will be available at value, that's for sure. But I'm not convinced that he's top of Tottenham's list at this stage. And I would not say it's 100% guaranteed, even though it's possible that Jota even goes this window.
I just want to throw another couple of names at you. We've got Morgan Gibbs-White of Nottingham Forest, Serhu Guirassy, the Bundesliga, one of the standout players there this season, 17 goals in 14 games. There's Santiago Jimenez flying over in the Netherlands, Hwang Hee-chan, who Heung-min Son might have had a chat with on their flight to the Asian Cup today. Samuel Illing Jr. as well, currently in one of Tottenham's favourite shops, which we know as Juventus Football Club. Nico Williams and Yohan Bakayoko as well. Is there anything concrete in those names?
Yeah, I think that Tottenham are assessing, as we said a little bit earlier, whether they can bring in some kind of wide forward or goal scorer. I think a really concrete target is Santiago Jimenez, but only for the summer. There will be no exit, as far as I'm aware, in January, or if there is to be one, it's going to have to offer an incredible amount of money to Feyenoord. I don't think we're looking at 100 million, but well over 50 million, maybe 60 million, which is a lot of money, even though he's a form player. That might be value, by the way. But again, much like Gallagher, does Spurs have that kind of money that they want to drop? The other thing, of course, is that Spurs have to deal with Feyenoord, and they irk them a little bit when they moved for Arne Slot. So I don't think that would prevent a deal, but it's a bit of a factor in all of this. But I do think that Santiago Jimenez and Spurs is one to watch in the summer. I think that Hwang is on fire at the moment, personally, much like Solanke. I don't see a mid-season move, but you never know, because Spurs have got pull, and these type of players, when they're on form, might have their head turned. But both are going to be difficult to pull off in January, and I think Hwang is going to be in significant demand come the summer. And if you're sensible and you're Hwang, and this is what I'm told he's going to do, there'll be an assessment to work out what he's going to get. Because with respect to Hwang, it's a little bit of a surprise, the incredible form that he's in. And he's 27 years of age. And I say it's a surprise, the form he's in, because look at the kind of numbers dating really all the way back to Salzburg. And I know he's developed, and I know that he's become more direct, and I know that he's played in slightly different positions. But look at the numbers this season for Wolves. I think it's 10 Premier League goals and 11 in all competitions, compared, I think, to 9 in all competitions in the previous 2 seasons for Wolves. So he's scored more goals in the last 20-odd games than he did in basically 60 for Wolves when he was loaned from Leipzig and then when he was a permanent signing. Go back to Leipzig, and I think he went through an entire Bundesliga season in maybe it was 2020, 2021 without scoring a goal. In the Bundesliga 2, when he was on loan at Hamburger, he wasn't prolific. So the last time he was in double figures that I can remember anyway would have been either at Liefering or at Salzburg. And that's sort of 5, 6, 7 years ago. And now he's exploded on the scene at 27. Now, if a 21-year-old does that, you go, wow, we're going to get 6, 7 years out of him. But if a 27-year-old does that, you have to be careful if you're Spurs, and you pay a big amount of money, is this the beginning of 3-4 years of prolific scoring, or is this season an anomaly? And naturally, the price is going to be really high for Hwang. So there's a bit of due diligence. And I even think if you're Spurs, you might want to see how the second half of the season goes to be sure that those 11 goals turn into 20 goals. And then you might consider a move in the summer. But I think that somebody with respect to Hwang, who I think is a fantastic character and player, somebody could almost try a move too soon with Hwang and be a bit burned by that signing for the kind of price that they'd have to pay. The other interesting name from the list that you gave is Gerassi, who is somebody that Tottenham have considered. And there's many, many suitors. And the reason for that is because there's a release clause at just over 15 million. It's 17.5 million euros, which is incredibly cheap for one of Europe's most prolific goal scorers. And it's clear that Gerassi is open to the move because he hasn't signed a new deal at Stuttgart, and Stuttgart have been trying for quite some time. So that's the kind of name that if you get towards the end of the window, you might try your luck with a release clause of that nature. But the counterpoint again for January, and I know it all sounds very negative, and what I am basically saying is a lot of these names, I think Spurs will wait and be patient because I think they want centre-back. And then I think everything else might be a bonus this window because they have to find the right name. And ultimately, they're going to have to spend budget in eventually replacing Kane. Not like for like, Kane's irreplaceable, but in terms of bringing in someone that will get you those 15 or 20 goals. And the downside of Gerassi is he's off to the African Cup of Nations. So it's all very well saying that you trigger the release clause and you bring him in January, but he's not going to be available until, even if they go out a bit early, the first week in Feb. And then if he moves, there's getting up to speed, there's integration, there's maybe some rest after the Africa Cup of Nations. So still a player probably that wouldn't be used in a squad if he makes a move until mid or late February. And that's very different to getting a proven Premier League player that can sign today and can give you all of January and all of February and make a more seamless transition. So the upside of Gerassi is the release clause. The downside is Africa Cup of Nations and the volume of competition. But with all of these names, I'm not aware that Tottenham have made anything concrete at this stage. But let's wait and see whether that changes between now and the end of January.
Ben, I have to say, I am in disbelief of the knowledge that you, I can barely remember what I have for dinner, and you're out here rattling off how many goals Hwang Hee-chan scored in its vital.
Or maybe they're wrong. I don't know.
Years ago.
Take them as estimations.
I don't know. I'm sold. Bring him in now. Get him in now.
I just had to say that. I want to move onto a few potential outgoings. Ben, we had Hajduk Split boss Mislav Karalan confirmed that he wants to sign Ivan Perisic. He said, "I don't know how his recovery is going after the injury." The only thing I can say from my side is that I would like to have him in the dressing room whenever possible, and I think there is a bit of an acceptance among the Spurs fans that is a move that we are probably going to see. Potentially, we might not see Perisic in a Spurs jersey again. Could we see that departure in this January window?
Not in the January window. I think Perisic will recover. I mean, it's always possible that you try and line it up, but where's the urgency? Perisic is out, I think, for the remainder of the season or something close to it. So you're not going to be able to use him. And unless he specifically says that he wants to go back there now rather than the summer, I don't think this one has an urgency that needs to be resolved in January. But I think it does feel inevitable when the Hajduk sporting director, as you rightly say, said that there's dialogue and they'd like to bring him back. And we know that Perisic is open to that move as well. It would be very logical. And he's 34 now from memory. So by the time he recovers, you're heading into another season. And then you do feel like he becomes either surplus to requirements or somebody that even if Spurs still like, they would be prepared to let go. And if there's that sentiment of the player wanting to go to Hajduk Split, then it feels like it will be a deal that suits all parties. So it wouldn't surprise me if, as you say, it is the last time that we've seen Perisic in a Spurs shirt.
Ben, for time constraints, I'm going to bunch the next couple of names together. Eric Dyer, reports have been led to believe that he's been informed by Spurs he can find a new football club. We've got Sergio Reguilon that we've seen recently has had his loan terminated, it appears mutually, and he's now returned to Spurs with reported interest from Bournemouth, Seville, Villarreal, And there has been also some reports Spurs may consider recalling Javik Tanganga from his loan at Augsburg due to his lack of playing time. I believe he's yet to make a single appearance there at all. Those 3 players, what do you feel their futures are, Ben, in a Spurs shirt, if any? And I do appreciate in the comments, Ryan Sessegons's name keeps popping up. What I would say is that Ryan is still recovering from an injury. So I don't know how realistic that would see Ryan's departure. But yeah, Ben, feel free. I'll just bunch those names together because of time constraints. Any real interest in those guys maybe leaving the football club or going back out on loan respectively?
Yeah, Eric Dyer is free to leave. It's as simple as that. And I think Spurs are thinking more just about getting the salary off the books. That's the primary concern there. I know we've seen some West Ham links. I don't want to pour entirely freezing cold water on them, but they've been downplayed a little bit by sources close to West Ham. So we'll see how that develops. But the interest is legitimate enough. I just don't think that anything's moved to any degree. It wouldn't surprise me if Sporting try. And the other interesting bit of information that I received a couple of days ago is that Luton Town might be one of the clubs that are taking a look as well. So keep an eye on that one. You've heard that news first here on The Last Word on Spurs. Then with, I think, Reguilon, there was always this break clause. So you may remember, if we flash back a little bit, that when Manchester United were looking for left-back cover, they originally wanted Marc Cucurella, and it was a lot harder deal to do. And in the end, Manchester United were not able to facilitate this break clause. And then they got Reguilon, but it was always likely that it would end in January. So this isn't really a massive surprise at this point. And we wait and see now, because he's only just fresh back. But I am told that Spurs don't see Reguilon as part of their immediate plans. So if they get the right kind of interest, then I do think that we'll see movement. The links that are longer standing are Bournemouth and Villarreal. Some will say Sevilla as well. I'm told Dortmund are interested, but their number one choice is Ian Maatsen, who can play left back or in a more advanced position. So if they agree a deal for Maatsen, and that's moving along quite nicely at the moment, then it takes Reguilon off the table. But if they don't get Maatsen, Dortmund could enter the race. And Roma might be a possibility as well. I think from Reguilon's point of view, he'll probably want the carrot of some kind of European football, which might make it quite difficult for Bournemouth. So it puts other clubs in Europe in the box seat compared to maybe a Premier League club like Bournemouth, even though they're doing really well at the moment. So that's the sort of situation there. And then with Jarrett Tanganga, not a lot to add. I think Ali Gold, who's a top guy and journalist, no doubt you'll have him on during the window as well to give you much better information on Spurs than I can. But I think he was first to say that Augsburg and Spurs are set to terminate the loan. And he's absolutely right. He's struggled. It's been a tough spell for game time. I think he picked up a knee injury as well. And it looks like that loan is going to end early, which is disappointment, because that loan, to my knowledge, though it's only off the top of my head, so apologies if the terms were only loan based, but I think there's an option in that deal as well from memory. And therefore Spurs were obviously quite hopeful when that loan was done that it would go well and that Augsburg would take the option and then they would be able to get Tanganga off the books. And now they're in a situation where they have to deal with the player again. So I think that it's probably not going to continue at Augsburg simply because the game time isn't there, but not too much to add on that particular situation. I'll try and make some inquiries over the next couple of days.
Ben, we want to finish this off with a couple of quick fire questions. I always say my two favorite questions. First of all, I want to ask you, what do you feel will constitute success for Spurs and Ange Postecoglou in this season?
Well, I think success comes with stability, and stability comes with time and making executive appointments and building this feel-good factor. So whatever happens, Postecoglou's kind of tick that box. And then if Scott Munn and so on can all kind of bed in, you get in a position where everything's looking healthy heading into the next season. And naturally, Spurs need some kind of European football. And I think success for Spurs, if top 5 ends up qualifying for the Champions League, will be getting in the Champions League. But it's just so tight. And it's one of those seasons where Tottenham started so fast. Then they had such a lull. And now it's picked up. And they're really not that far off the top. And they're only a point off the top 4. And you look behind and you think there's a bit of a cushion because West Ham are 34, I think Spurs are 39, and then Brighton and Manchester United and Newcastle, they've all been quite inconsistent. And I think they're only on like 29 and maybe 31 and 31. So if Tottenham can start the year in the Premier League well, go and get a statement win away at Manchester United and open up that gap, and then beat Brentford at home, who are struggling, they set themselves up with high expectations. And then success, I think, has to be defined. If you get 22, 23 games in, success has to be, especially if it's top 5, qualifying for the Champions League. But that might be deemed as being ahead in the project. That might be deemed as being overperforming. So this is the kind of irony for me that if Spurs were like 8th in the table now, like Manchester United, and if they were entertaining and scoring goals and it was all positive, but they were inconsistent, and a 4-1 win over Newcastle was constantly followed by a 4-2 type loss against Brighton, then at this point, halfway through the season, Spurs fans would probably be saying, we accept we've got injuries, we accept it's a new project, we accept that next season will probably be when we start to see the real fruition. So we're going to wait, we're going to enjoy it, and we're going to see if we can get in the Europa League. But because of where Spurs are, and because of how crazy the season's been, and because of the potential, you almost feel like if you're 5th now and only 1 point off the Champions League, success is Champions League. And it has to be as simple as that. And if they fall from that top 5 now and let West Ham close a 5-point gap, Brighton close an 8-point gap, Manchester United close an 8-point gap, Chelsea close an 11-point gap, then it will all end in doom and gloom. So I think that's the sort of irony almost, that they're victims of their own success. So now halfway through the season, the bar's been raised. And I feel sorry in that respect for Postecoglou, because I genuinely think that he's doing a phenomenal job. He's outperforming on a shoestring squad-wise because of all the injuries. He's lost his most influential player in Maddison. He's lost his most influential centre-back. He's got a new keeper who's been fantastic but is still new. Kane's left. And if you add all of that up, then you say, how are they 6 points off the top? How are they right in the mix for Champions League? How is the mood so good? How are they so damn exciting to watch? How is everything moving in the right direction? How? It shouldn't be possible, but it is. So you either take that and say, well, now there's pressure to continue it, even if it's completely overperforming, or you say, if they don't quite finish the season strongly, there's mitigating circumstances. And I think fans will be divided on what side of the coin they're on. But I think success for Spurs is keeping the buzz, keeping the mood, keeping the unity, getting the injuries back, and then ultimately trying, if they possibly can, to get Champions League football.
Ben, I'm not going to ask you through any question. Could we? Matt, I'll hand over to stop me from asking that question.
Could we? No, I'm joking. To try and reach those metrics of success that you've outlined there, Ben, how many players do you think Postecoglou will get in this January window?
I think 2 will be the likelihood. I don't see 3, but it will depend on outgoings. So that's my prediction 2. Definitely 1. And who knows, we might have got movement on Dragusin this evening or tomorrow. I think we'll get a much clearer picture of how that financial negotiation is going before the end of the week. But I'd be really surprised if it was this new 35 million number. That's not what I'm hearing. I'm hearing Spurs' position is 70 to 20 million. And maybe they have to pay 1 or 2 million more. But I still think that around the 25 million mark, give or take a million, it will probably get resolved because the player wants the move. But we'll have to wait and see. It's not done yet, but it's advancing. There's not too many hurdles. And then one other to come in. The last thing I want to say is another bit of new information, not for January, but keep an eye, and I say this begrudgingly because some of you will know that I'm a Leicester fan, keep an eye on Casey McAteer, who's being looked at by 3 Premier League clubs, and Tottenham are one of them. The advantage for Leicester is that if they go up, of course, he stands the opportunity to play Premier League football. But the disadvantage for Leicester is that maybe James Maddison can put a word in and tell him to join Tottenham. So that's another name that's being considered. And he's a younger profile. He's got a high ceiling. And I think that, as we spoke about before, Spurs will look for the now and they'll look for the future. And McAteer potentially ticks both boxes. He made a blistering start to the season and then he unfortunately got injured. But that's one to watch over the summer as well.
Ben, I mean it when I say, genuinely, I look forward to every window just so I get to speak to you. And regardless of whether Spurs do business or not, I know I'm comforted by the fact Ben Jacobs is coming to last one on Spurs. And everyone in an hour just sits there and just like listens. And I know it's never ever an hour. Ben, I want to say a massive, massive thank you. I know again, unbelievable amount of comments of love, showing their appreciation. Always love having you on the show. Ben, for those that don't follow you, and I don't know why they don't, so please do. Ben, where can everybody find the wonderful work you do out there? Because you do so much, of course, not just in the window, outside the window. Where can we find you?
Yeah, so I left CBS as staffer and I'm now with TalkSport, as you say. So you can hear me doing Premier League commentaries. And I also cover the Middle East region for them, which is why I was overdoing the Club World Cup for TalkSport. Personal handles at JacobsBen on Twitter. And I have Instagram and TikTok, which is at Ben David Jacobs. I say that, but my Instagram is basically still dog photos. I told you this the last time I was on, and I said that it was going to improve. It hasn't improved. It's dog photos. It's family photos. There's really very little football news. There's a few egotistical selfies on there from me around the world, but I'll try and fix that. And TikTok has a bit of video content on it, and I'll hopefully try and enhance that over the coming weeks. But at JacobsBen, follow TalkSport. Shout out as well to the likes of Alex Crook, who's breaking some good news, and also Sam Matterface. They're people to keep across within the TalkSport stable that I really respect, and they do good work as well. So follow me. My DMs are open. I always try and interact. And more importantly than me, I think, the work that you do here is really important and impressive. And it's why I come on. And you're award-winning for a reason. So keep up the good work, because this is the kind of way the industry's gone over the last few years. And I think people appreciate the fact you let idiots like me sit back and ramble. You bring on other top journalists. You facilitate a forum where people feel like there's a genuine Spurs debate and conversation where you can learn new news with personality, with style, with the right kind of questions. It's comprehensive and you're worthy of your award and all of your hard work. So have a good window, and it can only get better from this show onwards in terms of the caliber that you bring on.
Well, Ben, listen, you've set that bar ever so high. I mean, Matt, I'm sure you agree. What a way to start the January window. We were never going to be let down by Ben. And I think Ben has made us all very excited for what's going to be, hopefully, a very exciting winner for Tottenham, Matt, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I know for a fact I've said this every time Ben has been on, but I need to watch back the show because I know there's no way I can fully process all the incredible knowledge and wisdom that has been thrown at us over the last hour and 37 minutes. So Ben, really do appreciate your time and your insight. And Ricky, appreciate you having me on, and looking forward to what will hopefully be a busy and exciting January transfer window.
Absolutely, Ben. I don't let the cat out of the bag. Hope we're going to get you back on towards the end of the month, where, fingers crossed, look, hopefully it won't be as a longer show because Spurs have already got all their business done. So they can do an overview of what they've done, fingers crossed. But it is always generally a pleasure. Guys, I want to say a massive thank you to our watching audience. There are about 1,100 of you that have tuned in, despite the fact we've battled live darts. And from what I understand, Luke Littler has done a Spurs. But listen, Spurs won't be doing Luke Littler this season. I want to say a massive thank you to the wonderful watching audience. For those that listen around the world, we have opened the January transfer here on Last Word on Spurs. We've been joined by the brilliant Matty Hayes, the superb Ben Jacobs, of course. Go and check him out. TalkSport's very own. Brilliant journalist, brilliant sports broadcaster. Blessed to have him here. Guys, thank you so much for all your support for the show. As always, from Matt, from Ben, from myself, keep safe, keep well. We've only just started. As always, come on you Spurs.